We often think of the best meal we ever ate, but what comes to mind when we think of the best meal we ever saw? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Kate Leahy, and I'm here with Molly Stevens. Molly, I think Colombiana was one of the first books you mentioned on our podcast. I think it was episode 5, the one about recipe writing. So how did this book come across your desk?
Yeah, Colombiana by Mariana Velásquez. And Mariana worked for me 20 years ago. When I was working on my very first cookbook, all about braising, Mariana was one of my first recipe testers. So I've sort of just been keeping an eye on her career. She was in culinary school at the time. She then graduated and moved to New York City. And so I've just sort of been paying attention to what she's up to. And when this book came out in the fall of 2021, I was just so proud and really excited to dive into it. So I'm thrilled that we're going to talk more about it today.
So 20 or so years ago, was it a snowy week in Vermont? How did you work together? What was it like?
Yeah, it was 20. I went and found my notes. It was 20 years ago. It was winter of 2002, 2003. And I was deep in recipe development for All About Braising. And I was no longer working at the New England Culinary Institute, but I had friends who were still there. And so I called up one of my friends. I wanted someone to come into my kitchen maybe once a week, just cook with me, because I was in that crazy making when you're working on a book by yourself and you're just like, you're rattling around in your own brain, in your own kitchen, and just to have company and someone to sort of bounce ideas off, taste things, do some dishes, just kind of get a break. And so Mariana started coming over every Saturday because that's what her schedule was at that point. And it was winter time. I don't even know how she got up this driveway. And, she's from Colombia. So she was not, I think it's her first winter ever in the North. And we would just cook together, braising, and listen to opera. For some reason, we listened to opera, and she was wonderful. And so after that, then she also continued to test offsite for me for the book too. So I still have testing sheets from the time together. She was a bright light then, and obviously continues to be one now. I would think that a lot of listeners would think that's pretty dreamy to just spend a day in your kitchen braising with you on a cold winter listening to opera. That sounds pretty great. You two just were the perfect fit for each other for that project. Yeah, it was a long time ago. I think she did some internships in restaurants, but she ended up in the test kitchen at Saveur as a recipe tester. And she didn't know food styling was a career choice. And someone mentioned something to her about food styling, and she just lit up and said, "What is that?" And has gone on to become, one of the preeminent food stylists, certainly in New York City. She did the food styling for Michelle Obama's book, American Grown. And she was actually the stylist on In the Heights, the Lin-Manuel Miranda movie. So she's become quite successful in that field. And now she's written a cookbook.
Our conversation with Mariana was so great because she talked about how she came to write a cookbook. And it's something that some people think you've had a burning desire to write a cookbook all your life. And other people, maybe they're so busy doing all these other amazing things that cookbook writing isn't at the forefront of their mind. So it was great to pick her brain about her process and learn how she put together such a spectacularly beautiful book. And I would say anyone who is in the doldrums of winter, if you just want a bright, fresh light, just pick up a copy of Colombiana. You'll be delighted. So with no further ado, let's go on to the interview. Mariana, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Molly and I are really looking forward to delving into your beautiful book, Colombiana. And before we get started, just tell us a little bit about the origin story of the book. How did it become conceived? I mean, what made you decide to write this book?
So, never in a million years, in all honesty, did I think that I was going to write a cookbook about Colombian food. It felt really intimidating. And also when I left for the US, I came here when I was 17, about to turn 18. I wanted to know everything about the food from everywhere else in the world. I didn't look back. I wanted to learn everything else aside from Colombian cooking. And so it took 22 years to have that full circle of my life in food to feel like I could write about Colombian cuisine from a place of authenticity, but also with the knowledge, that required. And so, and the way it happened was that I was with Liz Moody, who's a colleague and an author that I've styled her cookbooks. And one day we were having drinks at a bar in Brooklyn, and she asked me, "Why haven't you written a Colombian cookbook? And every time I've asked you, you've rolled your eyes." And I'm like, "Have I? I don't remember." And she gave me a deadline. She said, "You should put together a proposal, and I'm going to give you a deadline." And I said, "Okay, I'm ready." And literally that day, I went home. My husband was away on a trip, and I started writing. And it was the book poured out of me. I mean, I thought about the chapters. I thought about what recipes to include. And I still have the notebook. It was really just it was inside of me the whole time.
So this was the proposal.
The proposal.
You've been working in cookbooks for, well, not quite 20 years, but you've been working on other people's cookbooks for a very long time, and some incredibly, notable cookbooks and food styling for film and doing all this sort of amazing stuff. Had you thought about writing, whether it was about Colombian food or not, your own book at all?
It seemed like a really daunting task, especially because I saw what it takes, and the research and the work and the testing and, working with authors and seeing their process. I thought, if I'm going to write a book, it needs to come from a really true place. It has to be something that I really want to write about. And it's a story that needs to be real.
Yeah.
And so it couldn't just be made up for me, like, oh, easy dinners. Well, no, it can't be that, right? Like, it needs to be something from the core. It wasn't a plan that I had originally made.
That's amazing. How long did that take you to write the proposal?
So she said 6 months. And I said, you cannot tell me 6 months. I need to write this in a month. Otherwise, I won't do it. For me, it needed to be something that happened right away. Otherwise, if I dilate the process, forget it. I just put it in a drawer. And so I wrote the proposal in a month. Obviously, that proposal transformed massively once I signed with an agent who helped me really refine the proposal and helped me add all the elements that publishers look for. And so that took about 4 additional months. So in total, 6 months it took me to write the proposal.
How close is the book to what your original vision was?
You know what? It's really close.
Yeah.
It's really, really close. And it was interesting because I met with a few agents. There were 2 that really wanted to change the book. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, no, I can't go that route, because then I'm going to be writing something that I'm not committed to. And that it seemed like it was, from a marketing standpoint, maybe even more successful, but it wasn't what I wanted to write.
You wanted to write a book from your core, and it sounds like this was not a book that you could have come up with overnight. This is a book that's probably been percolating in your subconscious or unconscious mind for for your whole life, maybe?
Yeah, definitely.
That's really interesting, though. But your approach, you had 3 agents interested in working with you. So what kinds of questions did you ask them to make sure that you found the right fit, that you worked with somebody who kind of was aligned with your vision?
Well, one, if they believed in the idea, if they thought that this was a book that would sell. I asked them if they thought that Colombian cuisine was something that the US or the international market was interested in and ready for. And I did quite a bit of research of what Colombian cookbooks were out there, especially in English. And there were very few, and nothing newer than 15 years ago, like published 15 years ago. And so not in English or in English, but self-published, etc. So, it's also, the work with the agent is so personal, right? They become your therapist, your editor. In my case, there were these 2 wonderful women, and they took me under their wing and guided me through the whole process. And I learned so much along the way. I had no idea, even after having worked in so many cookbooks in my life, I didn't know the entire process that it took. So it was very enlightening.
Several things stand out, but you talk about the organization, the chapter organization, which we'll talk about, is not standard. It's a very unique chapter organization. But then the other thing that you're very upfront about is that you say that you wanted to write, style, and art direct your own cookbook, which is not something that every author does. And clearly, you bring to your work such a design and artistic vision. Was that something from the very beginning that was part of the conversation?
Yeah. So what I did for the proposal, which I know that it's usually not the case, but because of my work as a stylist, I did a whole test shoot with a dear friend, Lauren Volo, the photographer. For the proposal, we shot a lot of the recipes. So visually it was already part of the conversation. It was part of what I was bringing to the table. I'm going to write this book, but visually, this is the light I'm thinking. This is how it feels. This is how it feels on the page. And I think that that was a great hook in a way, because we were presenting a book that already looked like the final product. And we didn't end up working with Lauren for different reasons in life. But yeah, being able to, the publisher gave me total freedom. They were like, we trusted, we saw these images, we've seen your work, go for it.
Wow.
Let's talk a little bit about the chapter organization, because like Molly was saying, you're breaking the mold of sort of a classic way a book would be put together. And I mean, you have one chapter, A la Mesa, that's more than 120 pages, 8 regional menus. And you also have, hosting plans, like cocktails, like you really give somebody the blueprint to throw a party or a feast for their friends. So tell us a little bit about what you were thinking when you put together your book.
You know what? It was the way that I remember food from home, and it's through the times of day. When I think of breakfast in Colombia and the different places of the country and what the light feels like and what nature is like and what the culture of each place represents. And so I wanted to really highlight that and my experiences throughout the times of day.
The first chapter is the breakfast.
Exactly. It's the breakfast. Right. And it's breakfast from different places in the country that I've experienced and loved or that are very representative. And then a la mesa is where the traditional Colombian cooking happens, like that one pot meal. The feast is usually midday. And so I didn't want to write a regional cookbook of Colombia, right? Like the regions, the Pacific, the Atlantic. I wanted to write a book through my eyes. And so these menus represent all those places, like all the regions essentially. But because each region feels so different because of climate, the way people dress, the music they listen to, I thought that it was a good opportunity to explain Colombia through those menus essentially.
There are a couple of things, like the regional menu chapter could have been an entire book on its own.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, it's almost a book within a book. It's probably about half of the book.
Yeah.
But yet you chose to have, the breakfast chapter and then the afternoon snacks, sort of street food chapter. And then I think we'll talk later about there's a Colombian-ish chapter and a dessert chapter. So, but yet desserts are also in the A la Mesa chapter menus, too, because the menus chapter, which totally makes sense. But I really feel like your holistic approach to cooking as a host, as a creator of a scene, as a, food as art, without that central chapter, it would not have, I don't know where you would have brought that in, but you bring that in throughout. Like I was just reading about your advice on how to seat people, which is just, really good advice. Like if you're having a dinner party, And I have to say, we talked about this in the introduction before we spoke with you, but when you were working for me 20 years ago and testing recipes, and Mariana, I went back and found some of your notes that you wrote.
Oh my God.
And I found a note, and it's, of all things, it was for a Yankee pot roast, because here we are in Vermont. And so I'm having you test a Yankee pot roast for me. And I have this little recipe testing form that I still use today. And at the top I say, is the recipe worth the effort? You answer it, and then you say, I think if I were serving this pot roast to my guests, I would open the lid at the table because I would not want them to miss the irresistible aromas. So there you are, 20 years ago as a culinary student, already imagining a dinner party or imagining a table full of your friends or family, and that you would be carrying this pot to the table. And it was right there from the start, this instinct, this impulse of yours to create a whole setting.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? Where did you get your knack for entertaining?
Yeah. So my mom is a great host, and, she's made a business from it. She has these beautiful homeware shops in Colombia. And so the ritual of the table really comes from my mom and my grandmothers too. In different ways, both my grandmothers were amazing cooks, and they would set beautiful tables and always have us over. But my mom's sophistication, kind of like she added that part, So So yeah, I think that food without that, it's not the same, like I think that the table is where it all happens, and that's why it matters, and that's why recipes that take hours or a lot of effort are worth it.
I think what you're saying is a reminder to myself, because my mom is more on your side, Mariana, of like throwing these beautiful parties, and the table is just as important. And what's on the table and decor is just as important as the food. And I'm always trying to simplify the decor so the food takes front and center. But I feel like I need to take some lessons about the balance that both are important when you're creating a mood. And I think it's really smart the way you did weave the regional ideas into your book without making it into a regional Colombian cookbook.
Right.
Because that way, I think it's just easier for someone to pick up the book and just fall into these stories rather than thinking, well, I don't know where that region is, so I don't have a concept of what the food of that region would be like.
Right.
So I thought that really kind of was a interesting approach to it. But what was some of the biggest challenges while writing this book? One of the things was you probably couldn't go to Colombia. It was a lockdown, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly that. So, I mean, one of the biggest challenges was the recipe testing, I have to say, because a lot of these food makes a lot of food, especially the a la mesa menus.
They all serve 8, I think.
Right, exactly. So it's like, okay, I need to plan this testing for when maybe I can have people over. But then that meant like testing and hosting, like double the work. And just, like the production that it takes to prepare all these food, and then like what to do with it, right? Or have people over, have people pick it up, and all of those logistics, it's a lot. And I remember, Molly, when we were testing all about bracing, that there was a lot of that, like, oh my God, 7-hour leg of lamb. I need to have people over. Because
Right.
Yeah. So that was a big challenge. And then also later when we went to do the photography for the book, that's when we were, it was April 2020 that we were supposed to go to Colombia. We had pre-produced an entire trip. It was ready. We were ready, plane tickets booked, the whole thing, houses already reserved. And it was a road trip from Bogota to the Caribbean coast for 15 days that we couldn't take. And honestly, it would have been a very different book. So we ended up photographing it here in New York in August when we were still kind of in lockdown, and we did it here in my apartment. Thankfully, I had collected enough props. My mom was able to send me a box of props that I had been saving there too, that miraculously arrived. And then I rented other pieces, but we shot it all here. And if we had taken that trip to Colombia, it would have been, I think, more of a travel book. It wouldn't have been bringing Colombian food out of Colombia. It would have been different. So I think at the end, even though there was a moment of huge frustration, I think this was the best thing for the final result.
It would have been a travel book in its design, or?
No, I mean, I think the images would have been much more in context and in place. And that would have separated the reader or the cook from the content, right? Like maybe it would have felt too distant. Here, all the recipes were prepared here in Brooklyn, which means that anybody can do it in the US or overseas, which was the point of the book, like sharing my cuisine or Colombia's cuisine with people that are not from Colombia or that don't live in Colombia.
That's a good point. Then with the photos too, if you had shot in country, there would have been certain dishes that would have been hard to recreate in the States, because maybe certain ingredients would have been hard to find or hard to source. And by you saying that you shot everything here, that meant that all of us can find these ingredients if you can.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the very beginning, you have these wonderful graphic charts, sort of main ingredients and equipment and things that are really central to Colombian cooking. And on several where it says substitutes, good substitute suggestions, the answer is blank. It says none.
Yeah.
So meaning if you can find it, great, use it. But if you can't, you make something else or just leave it out. So having to make it here, it makes it very much like this is a cookbook for American cooks, and written in American English for American cooks.
Yeah.
You talked about it when you were doing the proposal, you sort of knew what the recipes would be. And I'm just curious because there's such a really wonderful breadth of recipes in here. I mean, I was just looking at these like those popped sorghum and tahini sweets. And we were talking about brisket dust before you came on.
Before you came on, yeah.
So good.
Which is something I'm dying to talk to you about. But just how did the process of coming up with the recipe list and then researching them?
Well, I mean, all the recipes in the book are foods that I've always loved. You know, I mean, like, there isn't anything that I'm like, I've never tried that or I've never made it. Well, there were a couple things that I had never made. And then before lockdown, you know, like in 2019, when I was still writing the book, I went to Colombia and I learned how to make some of these things. But everything was really close to me and to my story and to my memories of Colombian food. So deciding how to balance each chapter and what to include and the things that made it and the things that didn't make it were really based on, do these recipes translate and do they travel well? And one of the things I truly believe is that there's some foods, like for instance, this fried arepa with egg, arepa de huevo, that is very much a street food of the Caribbean coast. You know, it's totally doable here, and you can find harina pan and the eggs and the oil. Like, it's a very simple recipe. But I truly believe that you need to be standing on the sidewalk in Cartagena at like 90-degree weather to really just like get the gist of it, right? Like, it's, to me, that's an experience that doesn't travel. You know, it's just not the same. And so there were recipes that I initially wrote on my list that then I thought I would never make that in New York, you know? So it's also that. It's foods that I would crave here, that I would be willing to make here. And there's some things that I just need to get on a plane and go home to eat it, you know?
Well, I love there's an essay on the bolos.
Yeah.
And there's no recipe for it because I kept going. I was like, well, where's the recipe? I need to make these. I need to make these. And at the end, you say they're too hard to make or they wouldn't translate, as you say. But I as a Colombiana, I would be in trouble if I didn't mention them. So I wrote an essay about how important they are, but I'm not going to tell you how to make them.
Exactly.
I like that too, because you're being honest. You're not saying, okay, so I'm going to give you a watered down version that I know you can make at home. You're saying that really you're either going to try it in Colombia or you're not going to try to make it at home. And I'll give you a lot of other ideas of things you can make at home perfectly, well. So I think that was really smart. And it also gives, like you said, this is from your core. This is like a true story. This isn't 101 easy recipes to make on a weeknight from Colombia. So maybe that's a different book.
Exactly.
So how did the visuals come into your recipe development and your creation process?
I mean, as a food stylist, I always think about how food is going to look, right? I mean, I do conceive a recipe from a visual standpoint first. You know, I imagine, okay, sancocho, how would I serve it? How would I plate it? And sort of work backwards. Something like the oatmeal popsicles, which is kind of a transformation from this drink, like an horchata, kind of like an oat horchata, but I made it into popsicles. They became popsicles because I thought about visually in the book what would be fun and how to mix it up. Yeah, for me, it really starts in the end, essentially.
That makes a lot of sense. And so I'm looking at page 238. There's a ceviche de palmito and pomelo.
Yeah.
And I mean, it is an incredibly beautiful photo. I could see that being something that you're like, this will look great on a plate. Can you tell me a little bit about how that recipe came together?
So hearts of palm are a very important ingredient for us now because they have become a replacement crop for illicit ones. And the government has been trying to promote agriculture where people can make a living without having to grow coca or other crops that, of course, are more profitable. And so hearts of palm, because they're an export product and they grow so well in the region, were one of the ones that were chosen. And, supporting eating hearts of palm is supporting all those farmers that are making that choice. And so I wanted that. And then the pomelos, when they're in season in Colombia, they're incredible. Like in Southeast Asia, they're kind of like pearls, right? That pop in your mouth. So I wanted a recipe that was very fresh and citrusy and wonderful. And then radishes add that spicy and also color, So there were all the flavor elements that I love, and that's why it's in the chapter of Colombianish. It's all those ingredients that are very much Colombian, but they're my own take.
Tell us about that chapter and how it came together.
Well, because I felt that, I don't make the red bean soup every Sunday. I mean, that's not the way we cook here, the way, with all these travel. I make Colombian food very much when it's celebratory, when it's moments that we're hosting, but it's not necessarily my everyday food. I mean, to be completely honest, I shop at the farmer's market. It's much more, I would say, yeah, market food with some Colombian elements at times, especially because my husband Diego is like, "Ay, Mari, can you make me the scrambled eggs with tomatoes and onions?" But so I wanted to include a chapter that was more contemporary, one could say, and including ingredients that people maybe are not so familiar with, and just a different take and a different approach.
And there's another element of the book that's not really in the chapters, but it's sprinkled throughout. I think there are 5 maybe profiles of Colombian women.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So because we couldn't go to Colombia to have all these portraits of the Colombianas, we thought, well, let's celebrate those Colombian women who left the country, who now in the US continue to tell the stories of our food in different capacities, from the woman who owns a restaurant in Bushwick to the one who runs an NGO for food security. So all these women are the carriers of our traditions overseas. So we wanted to profile them and tell their story. And it's the Colombianas here. And I don't know if you also saw the images that are more archival photos.
Yes.
So that was also a resource of like, okay, we can't be in Colombia. What do we do? And this great friend of ours who works in books and rare books, he said, go to the archives because they'll have beautiful imagery that will give the book a lot of texture and will show Colombian women throughout history. So we found, oh my God, it was like 10,000
Wow.
digitalized images from, since the 1800s. And of course, the search engine was very complex. So I would try, it took me hours to find the images I wanted, but it was such a pleasure. I discovered so much throughout.
Yeah, they're very distinct and they certainly stand out from, it's sort of shocking to me that you took most of the pictures or all of them in your home, because Kate and I have been talking about the light in this book.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like New York City.
No.
The light is definitely very transportive. Obviously, that was a very deliberate choice to have that sort of bright sunshine that saturated these colors, these incredible. You talk about maximalism. But that's in these photos of the food too. It really stands out. They're just filled with color and filled with light and shadow.
Yeah. So Gentle and Hires, these couple, their husband and wife team, it was our first shoot after lockdown in March, right? Like that July was the first time we were all back on set. I think that really showed on the images. Like everyone's creativity was, sometimes we work back to back and we're kind of drained creatively. It was taking that break during the summer and having that space and then jumping back in. They really poured their hearts into this, and because they were as bummed as I was to not go to Colombia together.
Were they going to go with you?
Yeah, they were the photo team. The publisher also said, you do have to turn the images in August so that we can stay on schedule. And I was like, and Colombia's borders were closed. They were closed, not even for Colombian nationals. You had to have a special permit to fly in. Yeah, we just couldn't go. So at the beginning of each day, we would sit and have coffee and breakfast together before beginning the shoot day. And we would go over the recipes and I would tell them what the recipes were from. And they would read the head notes and see and hear the stories of like, okay, this is what the weather is like where we make the lentils, like in the Cauca River Valley or the sancocho or the beans. So we had a meeting every morning and talked about these places and what they felt like.
So just the way in your menu chapter, you set a scene, you were doing this in the morning on your photo shoot for your team, setting the scene for each setting, each dish.
Yeah.
As a food stylist yourself and a cook and the cookbook author, what role did you play on this team?
Oh my God, I was cooking everything. I did it all.
Oh my gosh.
No,
Did you
also,
have another stylist to help you?
no.
Oh, Mariana.
No. It was crazy.
Did you
It
have
was
a
really
cook to
crazy.
help you?
Yeah. I had a kitchen assistant, and then we brought in a second kitchen assistant. And because, we needed to keep the crew slim, this was still the height of COVID.
Right.
And so we just needed to stay like not too many people. So I had 2 kitchen assistants, and then I did the rest. I mean, I didn't sleep for days. We shot for 12 days, 2 location days, and it was crazy. I mean, we made so much food.
I should also tell the listeners that you yourself appear in several of these photos looking as glamorous as ever.
I don't know how you pull it off.
I mean, there was one day there was hair and makeup that saved me, but there's some of those photos that I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah, there are a lot of your hands, your arms from the neck down too. So.
Wait, I'm really curious about this. I've never seen this on a photo shoot where the team meets in the morning and doesn't just go over the shot list, but goes over actually the place where this is being inspired from. I think that's really brilliant. I'm going to write a note for that in case if I'm ever working in a situation like this. But tell me a little bit about how you stayed ahead, because were you also then the prop stylist and you're picking out the props and thinking through what everything's going to be plated on, what's going to be in the photo? So how did you balance all that?
So, what was wonderful about working with Marty and Andrea is that Andrea really, she loves the propping part too.
Oh, good.
So I would say to her, okay, I'm going to make these desserts with guavas and blackberries, and it's like a frozen cheesecake. What do you think? And she's like, okay, let me bring you some options. So she would just really help me with that. And there were moments that she would pick things that I would have never picked that made the image incredible. And that's what it's so brilliant about collaborating, is that something that you would never do that is right there just transforms and becomes something completely different if someone else does it. So yeah, that was so great.
Now, it's a wonderful when a team can come together, even in really challenging circumstances. And so I'm sure you were trying to scramble on where to put all the food too and give the food to people too. It's a lot of food to cook in 12 days.
So, what we did was there was a site, like a testing site very close to here. So we kept packaging it and bringing it to the nurses and people there. They loved us. I mean, we brought desserts and things, as much as we could to also keep it safe and the whole thing. But yeah, and I froze quite a bit of it too.
I'm sure. Oh, that's really fascinating, just because, I think a lot of us, we either are purely writers or we're purely food stylists or purely photographers. And it sounds like you've been able to do all of these and balance and wear all these different hats and to create your book. It's pretty impressive.
Oh, thank you. I've enjoyed it. It's been amazing.
I'm curious about, since the book has come out, what recipes are you finding are resonating with people? Are you surprised by some of the recipes that people are responding to, or what are some of your favorites?
So it's been really surprising that people do prepare the full menus, and they send me the photos of when they made the lillet and the lentils and the whole thing. I mean, and do the playlist and they write me notes about it. And that has been so amazing. Incredible. And Molly, I mean, you introduced me to Lillet. You're aware of that. Molly Stevens is all over this book. I quote inside you several times.
Oh.
So yeah, the menus, people preparing the whole thing. And then it's been kind of random. It has been kind of random and all over the place, which has also been surprising. From desserts to a lot of breakfast, empanadas. People make a lot of empanadas, arepas, arepa de choclo, which was featured at the New York Times, was big when it happened. And many people send me photos of that. But so, yeah, kind of all over the book, which has been really fun.
It's funny. We talk about design, and one of the design elements of this book that I've noticed, and it's partly the chapter organization being sort of non-standard, but it's almost like you have to journey through it to discover things in the book. Like it, and I don't know if this is deliberate on your part, but the table of contents is very straightforward. But then like the menu chapter, you don't list the menus and their pages, and there are page numbers missing. It's not listed. So you're sort of, you have to find something in this book. You need to go looking through it. And to me, that's very much like a travel experience that you never really know what you're going to find when you go travel. I mean, there are two ways to travel. There's travel the people who have that very specific itinerary, and we're going to go here and do this and go there and do this. And they don't leave time for any of that, serendipitous discovery, spontaneity. But in this book, I feel like you've made some design decisions that, and I'm wondering if it was deliberate or if you had pushback from the publisher, but by not giving page numbers to where these menus are or the profiles of the Colombian women, or you have to go looking. And in looking, every time I go through this book, I find something I didn't find the last time.
I love that.
So am I making that up, or was that deliberate?
It's the way I look at cookbooks. When I get a cookbook, I look at it cover to cover and I read it. I read the recipes, which is also something that you taught me, Molly. Like, recipes should feel like you can read a cookbook and not make a single thing from it, but the recipes should be a joy to read. And so that's how I read cookbooks. And so I thought mine should give you that sense of discovery and take you through without giving you a map before, essentially.
Yeah, a lot of the pages have full bleed or color that goes right to the edges, and so on some of those they're just so stunning, and I mean you could frame them; they're beautiful. You said no page number. I'm not going to put a page number on here.
The designer that we worked with at Harper Wave, I mean, she was incredible. I mean, she worked with me and totally indulged me so much, and that was one of her ideas. She was like, I don't want to put a number on this image, like it will ruin it. Let's just leave it as is. So that was her.
Okay. Wow. It's very interesting. And it's a choice, I think, that I'm sure in other situations there'd be pushback where it'd be, no, we have to have a number on every page. But it was just very interesting to me going through it, how that changed my experience. It's like losing your map and you're like discovering things that you might not have known were there.
Right. Because this book is so visual, how did you work with the art director or the graphic designer from Harper Wave? How was that relationship?
There was a lot of back and forth. One of the things that I had always dreamed of doing was receiving the galleys, like physical galleys, and be able to ride on them. And well, that didn't happen.
No, it didn't.
No, it was all digital because that's because of the moment and everything. And that was something that I was like, oh, does that happen anymore? I don't know, but that seemed like it was so fun. So I had to learn how to do it on the PDF format and do the notes on the PDF. So I think that made the process a little bit longer because, it's not the same when you can literally write the note, like add this image here. I don't know.
Yep.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, we need to ask you about arepas because we noticed that there's, I think, 3 in the breakfast chapter, and then you have more arepas later in the book. One thing about arepas that I didn't know is how many different base that you have for them to make different ones. We have one with hominy, like I think you have an option to use canned hominy. You can use masa harina. You can use. So just tell us a little bit about what place arepas have in your book.
Well, the thing is that defining Colombian cuisine is very difficult because Colombia is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. And so it's not one cuisine, it's many, and it's incredibly based on every single town. And because of our history of conflict, a lot of these towns have stayed very encapsulated, right? Like very compartmentalized. And so there's food that doesn't travel even within. There's things from the coast that someone from the center of the country don't know about or are not familiar with. And so unless you're like a culinary researcher and someone who's very passionate about it, you just don't see the same things throughout the country. And arepas are one of the unifying thread of our cuisine. And they appear in different doughs and forms and sweetness and presentations and times of day in every place of the region. So that's why arepas were so important. And being that now so many Venezuelan migrants live in Colombia, they're our brothers, they're in our country. Arepas are very important to them too. And so I thought that it was essential to give arepas that place. And of course, the one recipe that has a typo is in one of the arepas. And that haunts me.
We all have those.
Water.
We all have
Oh my God. There's a quantity of the water that is wrong that just, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. But it happens in every book, right? I mean, I hope.
It happens in every book.
It happens in every book. I'm almost relieved when I find it because I'm like, I hope this is the one typo, because you can't have a book that doesn't have any typos. It's like just impossible. But I can't wait to dive in and try the variations, just because who doesn't want to eat that every day?
Yeah.
Like, it just.
And the brisket dust, before we let me go,
Yes.
tell the listeners what it is.
So the brisket dust is essentially an accompaniment to the red bean soup from the region of Antioquia. And because our cuisine is very humble, we use tough cuts of meat. It's beans, it's plantains, it's onions. There's no luxury in meat, there's no filet mignon. So I think brisket dust it's that resource to add that flavor to the soup by keeping it cost effective, essentially.
Yeah.
And my grandmother would always make it. So you take brisket and you cook it, you boil it to tears, and then literally you put it in the blender. It becomes this meaty, delicious powder that works so well, sprinkled over beans, sprinkled over rice,
like
on
umami.
soup. Exactly.
It's such a good idea. That name caught my attention too. Of course, it sounds so beautiful in Spanish, like carne en polvo, right? But then brisket dust, I'm like, oh, that could be like a new barbecue craze. I could see people in Texas with their brisket dust or something. So it definitely was eye-catching. Yeah. One thing that before we let you go, we also wanted to know is a lot of us are unfamiliar with Colombian cooking. And you say it's a hard cuisine to get your finger on because there are so many regions and it's so nuanced. Are there other books that we should look towards? Because I saw it in your bibliography, you did so much research. Are there certain books that you just have a special place in your heart that more people should know about?
Yeah, so there's a great book that has been re-edited 36 times. It's called Cartagena de Indias en la olla, Cartagena, Indias in the pot. And it was written by this woman who just passed away. She was in her 90s, called Teresita Roman. And this book, it's like talk about 1960s, right? So she has the chapters about Colombian cuisine, and she did a lot of research of all these recipes and foods and preparations that were a lot of them indigenous and very, very classic. But she also includes like aspic and like poached salmon with like an olive eye. She includes the whole range. It has like 3,000 recipes. It doesn't give a lot of instruction, but it's a great book to read and see. And it is in English. It's translated to English. So I recommend that one.
We'll include that in the show notes along with where people can find you. But can we ask, is there another book in your future?
Yeah, so I have another book in my mind. I want to give Colombiana its life. I don't want to write another book right away and let Colombiana be for a little bit longer. And I do think that this next one needs to cook also, and simmer a little bit more for it to be ready. Yeah. But yeah, I would love to write another book, especially now that I know the process, and I know the steps and the relationship with your editor, and the whole thing was such a great experience that I would want to do it again.
Could you give our listeners parting words of wisdom for somebody who wants to embark on an epic project?
Well, if you choose to write a book, it needs to be very true to who you are, because it's a tough process. It could be discouraging at times and daunting. And if you're not fully committed, well, you'll probably just leave it to the side. Just truly believe it.
Yeah. We should also let people know that you do a Spanish language radio show.
Yeah, it's called Buen Limón Radio.
Great. Well, we'll link to that. You have your tableware line.
Casa Velásquez. Yes. It was the continuation of the narrative of the book, taking my aprons, which I've designed for years to wear on set, that became a business kind of on the side. And after the book came out, people would ask me, why don't you have a tableware line? I'm like, oh, well, that's a great idea. So now we have Casa Velásquez, and we're about to launch the new collection. And it's just a great way to combine everything I love.
That's beautiful. And are you still doing food styling?
Yeah, it's still my 9 to 5, as they say.
Wow. We really appreciate you taking time out of all of that to speak with us.
My pleasure. This was so fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. If you have a comment or question, ping us on our website, everythingcookbooks.com. You can also find more episodes at Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, or wherever you listen. If you like what you hear, please leave us a review. This helps a lot more people find the show. Any book mentioned on the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thanks to our talented editor, Abby Cirquitella. And until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.